guys, so I wanted to talk to you today about my favourite short story collections. Now, I'm by no means a short story collection expert. If you're already well versed in short story collections and have read hundreds, if not thousands, then the people whose channels you want to check out are Jen Campbell and Mercedes from Mercy's Bookish Musings, because they know their short story collections and I've had some fantastic recommendations from both of their channels. But I do enjoy a good short story collection, and with reading them I have, of course, immersed some favourites, and I figured since I have been asked a few times for recommendations on short story collections, I would tell you what my favourites are. These collections are of no specific genre. There are some trends in there, but there's also stuff from across the board, so hopefully there'll be something in here for you and you'll find a new recommendation. I'm going to start with some more traditional fairy tales, and that is Italo Calvino's Italian folk tales. This is a collection of Italian folk tales collected together and written down by Italo Calvino, who is quite the prolific Italian author. A lot, if not all, of his works have been translated into English. Fantastic stuff. This book I read when I was quite young, actually, maybe like between 10 and 12, and it blew me away. They're very traditional fairy tales. A lot of recurrent themes come up, a lot of recurrent little plot lines come up. If you're familiar with stuff like the Grimm tales and other traditional fairy tales, you'll understand what I mean. There's a lot of similarities in there, but despite that, I was so engaged whilst reading this, and I read it from cover to cover in the space of a week. And it's quite a big book, especially at that age, and it not being specifically targeted at children. So it clearly really engaged me, and those little similarities and repetitions didn't bother me at all. I fell in love with this collection, and I think if you're at all interested in fairy tales, then it's an amazing one to check out. Unsurprisingly though, I do have quite a few collections of fairy tale retellings which I adore. So let's start with those. So the first book I have is Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber and Other Stories. These are a collection of fairy tale retellings. Angela Carter retells fairy tales like Little Red Riding Hood, Puss in Boots, Bluebeard, and on top of that she also kind of incorporates some traditional kind of legends and retellings of those in there. So there's a couple of vampire tales in here, traditional vampire tales that Angela Carter has retold, so a bit of a variety in there. It is very much Angela Carter's famous style, which is beautifully eloquent prose, images and themes that kind of mess around with your head slightly, and quite dark tales. I mean, the traditional fairy tales themselves are quite dark, but these stories retain that darkness and present it in Angela Carter's own style. I really love this. I think Angela Carter's prose are just stunning, and I think one thing short stories highlight are beautiful writers, because I really think you have to have pretty eloquent and beautiful prose to pull off a good short story, and Angela Carter does that. Unlike Angela Carter, however, the next collection of short stories kind of abandons the magic realism and fantasy elements of fairy tales but retells them in a modern setting, and those are New World fairy tales by Cassandra Parker. There are tiny elements of magic realism in here. There's one story in particular which is very much magic realism, but most if not all of the others are entirely capable of being set in the real world, although being a little bit odd because they are fairy tale retellings. And these are all set in different states in America and follow the stories of characters who the author has kind of replaced the original fairy tale characters with. So we have Snow White in here, we have Cinderella in here, we have the Three Little Pigs in here. It tells stories like Jack and the Beanstalk, where the giant is actually a big businessman who's head of a company, and Jack is a young boy who ends up working in a sort of big financial conglomerate in the big city after being a farm boy. The Three Little Pigs follows three police officers who are all culprits of police brutality and are kind of being hunted down because of that, and so on and so forth. Again, another example of just absolutely stunning writing. I adored this collection so much, and I really want to pick up more of Cassandra Parker's writing. The next one is loosely inspired by Scottish folktales. There are elements of Scottish folktale and legend in there, although they're not necessarily direct retellings of fairy tales, and that is A Portable Shelter by Kirsty Loggins. This collection of short stories is told in an interesting fashion because it has sort of an overarching plot. There's not so much of a plot, but an overarching narrative where each story is being told by the two mothers of an unborn child to their child, who one of the mothers is obviously pregnant with. They've made a promise to one another to only tell their child truths, but either when the other one's at work or the other one's asleep, they tell the unborn child fairy tales and folk tales that Kirsty Loggins has created here. And there's this implication that there is truth in fairy tales and folk tales. I think the overarching narrative of the couple is nice. For me, it didn't particularly add anything. It was the folk tales I really enjoyed in this story, and that's what I'd recommend it as a really beautiful collection of kind of Kirsty Loggins adaptation and inspired stories by traditional Scottish folklore. Now, talking about authors who kind of came up with their own fairy tales, we have Ludmila Parish. There once lived a woman who tried to kill her neighbour's baby, scary fairy tales. And as the title sums up, these are kind of creepy, scary fairy tales, although they're set again in the real world. These ones, they kind of resemble the short stories of Roald Dahl, whose short stories are quite creepy, if you can imagine his children's books, but for adults. Creepy. That's what these are. I really like the author's writing style. It's very straightforward. Her prose are very simplistic, yet conjure very vivid images, and I really like this collection. Although it's set in the real world, it's full of elements of magic realism that kind of make it into fairy tales. And I've read some of the author's other collections which I enjoyed, but because they don't have that element of magic realism, I don't think they're as special as this collection, and this is the collection I really enjoyed. Having now read more of her stuff, I like that addition of magic realism or oddness, set in the real world but kind of unrealistic images. I'm sure you'll know what I mean by fairy tales in that sense. Very blunt, very melancholic, but also beautiful in their own ways. And one last collection of fairy tale retellings or fairy tale-esque stories I have to recommend before I move on to something completely different is Kissing the Witch by Emma Donoghue. These are again more straightforward fairy tale retellings, and these ones retain the original kind of fairy tale setting. They're set in a kind of magical historical period like most fairy tales rather than in modern day. So they retain the magic and the fantasy, but what Emma Donoghue does particularly well, and not just her beautiful writing, is that she kind of turns them on their head and makes all of these stories quite empowering for women. It's about women saving themselves and saving each other and not relying on men. It also explores romance between two women and really alters the original fairy tales through that, and it's very beautiful. They're very beautiful, they're often quite dark, and they're also quite romantic, and I just would highly recommend this collection. It really blew me away, and I would like to go back and reread it actually, because it's been a while since I first read it, a couple of years now. But last, but certainly not least for this video, the short story collection I want to mention last is the short stories of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes series. It would be a lie for me to do a short story collection video mentioning my favourites without mentioning this collection. Obviously one most of you will have heard of. You may or may not be aware that there are actually only 4 Sherlock Holmes novels, and they even then are more like novellas. They're very short. Most of Sherlock Holmes' adventures took place in short stories that were originally published in the Strand newspaper, and this here is a bind up of all of the short stories. The short stories are divided into 4 collections, and you can quite often buy them separately in those 4 collections, which also makes it kind of easier to read rather than in a big volume like this. But I am a massive Sherlock Holmes fan. Sherlock Holmes was so innovative for its time, and even now detective fiction, even if it's as good as this, is often inspired by this, or at least takes tips from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. The thing that's so interesting and fascinating about Sherlock Holmes is, one, it's damn right near impossible to figure out the mystery whilst you're reading it. They're not so much whodunits in that, oh, I think it was this person, I think it was that person. The clues aren't really there for you to solve. The narrative is told by Dr. Watson, so you only know what Dr. Watson knows, and Dr. Watson certainly doesn't know what Sherlock Holmes knows. And then at the end there's this huge unveiling of what really happened from Sherlock Holmes, and it will blow your mind. And although it might seem slightly unrealistic, these stories were actually inspired by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's lecturer at university. He studied medicine at university, and he had a professor who could look at a patient apparently, and without even hearing them speak, diagnose their illness, but not only that, tell you where they grew up, where they live now, what their financial situation was, what their religion was, just a whole host of amazing facts that he would observe from their appearance and details about them that most people wouldn't pick up on but were there. So Sherlock Holmes has never for me felt unrealistic, it's just kind of felt beyond me, but in a good way, and I find the prose of Arthur Conan Doyle very comforting, and there's just no mysteries like his Sherlock Holmes, so I would highly recommend. But those are all the collections of short stories I had to mention in this video. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you found some recommendations. If you have any favourite collections of short stories, please do recommend them to me in the comments down below. I would love to hear them. And until next time guys, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye! Today I'm going to give you a tour of one of my bookcases. This bookcase includes unread novels, non-fiction, books set in antiquity, poetry and short story collections, so I hope you enjoy.